Hello, class. Today we're going to take notes on A Journal of the Plague Year and a doctor's Ebola story. A Journal of the Plague Year is actually a full novel, but we're going to be reading an excerpt of it which appears in your book. And then a doctor's Ebola story is an excerpt from a memoir. One of the first things we're going to look at with these texts is analyzing the historical setting. So Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year is a work of fiction. However, the novel realistically portrays historical events in London in the summer of 1665. The text it's written from the perspective of a narrator who claims to have lived through these events. So the whole point of writing the novel this way is to create that verisimilitude, so the appearance of truth and actuality. The author wants us to believe that the things that they're describing are real or actually happened. The text is presented as an eyewitness account. The novel purposely blurs the line between fact and fiction. So there are many things that are written that are true, but there are also many that are stretches of the truth or small lies. As you read, notice details such as dates and times, geographical names and information, and numbers and statistics that establish the novel's historical setting. Specific locations are mentioned, and we'll talk about what effect that has for us as the reader as we actually get into this text. The next thing we're going to look at doing is analyzing narrator. Now, narrator is a character in the novel who relates the events in his or her own words using pronouns I, me, and my. It's somebody that is experiencing the event. The perspective of Defoe's narrator affects a reader's impression of what's happening. If somebody is telling you, I did this, we did this, my this, you're more likely to believe their story because, well, they're telling you they did it. And unless they give you a reason not to trust them, you'll trust them. In order to analyze the narrator, you may choose to keep a chart like this. So you write down details of the narrator, then what those details reveal, what characteristic they reveal about the narrator, and what overall effect does that those details and that characteristic revealed have on your impressions, right? So essentially, let's say we find out that the narrator lived through a house fire and the house was on fire and they were very calm. What characteristic does that reveal? Well, that reveals to us that they're very calm in nature and somewhat haphazard. What effect does that have on our impression? Well, if they're calm, cool, and collected, then we expect them to remain that way throughout, and we expect the story to be told in a calm manner. It can be helpful to keep a chart like this as you read, just because sometimes when you're trying to analyze different aspects of the text at the end, it gets a little complicated, and a chart allows you to do it slowly throughout the text while you read. We're also going to be looking at analyzing author's perspective. So author's perspective is a unique combination of ideas, values, feelings, and beliefs that influence the way the writer looks at a topic. In Inferno, the doctor's Ebola story, which is the next text, Stephen Hatch sometimes directly addresses the significance of his perspective as a doctor and as an American in an African country. So think about your perspective as you read things or as you do things. You are a high school student, which changes your perspective. You are an expat, most of us, which could change your perspective. You might be from a family of immigrants. You might be somebody that often travels to their home country. All of these things have an effect on your perspective. So in this case, the effect on the perspective is a little bit different because we have an American doctor who's in an African country. So his way of viewing things is going to be different than an African doctor in an African country because they might be more accustomed to certain practices than the American would. As you read a nonfiction narrative, pause to ask questions about how the author's background, beliefs, and experience shape his or her perception of people and events. Ask yourself about how the author assesses the motives governing the actions and behaviors of people, the emotional condition and response of others, the moral or ethical value of decisions, and the significance the meaning of words and actions have. So you just have to ask yourself these questions as you read in order to assess the narration, an author's perspective. Now, like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the second text we're reading is a memoir. A memoir is a form of autobiographical writing in which the author describes significant personal experiences in a first-person narrative. Memoir is like a collection of stories about a person's life. So what we can expect knowing that this is a memoir and the title Inferno, a doctor's Ebola story, is that this is a doctor's memoir. It takes this story or this part of it will take place during the height of Ebola. And they're going to be writing about what they experienced. In addition to recording details of events, memoirs express the author's thoughts and feelings at the time of the events and also upon later reflection. It's kind of like a diary in that personal nature, except there's time for reflection. Like, sometimes people don't write their memoirs for like 10, 15, 30 years after the events that they're writing about. And that's fine. But then, some details might not be as clear. Another example of a memoir that has become popular in the last few years is the book Educated, which is a memoir of a girl's quest for education, essentially. And it does the same thing as this, except it's telling the story about how she came to be who she was and how she got her education. It's telling that person's life story. In their memoirs, authors often address issues of wide social, philosophical, or historical significance. Readers, therefore, can deepen their understanding by connecting the text to their own experiences, to the experience of people they know, and to their own social and historical context. So the purpose, instead of writing just an autobiography, the purpose of writing a memoir is they'll be writing about something of some historical significance. And honestly speaking, you can also have like a commentary on a major event that happened. Now, we also are going to study a few language conventions, and we're going to talk about mostly clauses. So I'm going to start with subordinate clause. A subordinate clause has a subject and a verb, but does not express a complete idea. So it cannot stand alone in a sentence. And here's an example. Once my husband finishes work, we will go shopping. If we just have once my husband finishes work, that's not a complete sentence. Therefore, that part of the sentence is a subordinate clause. You may have also heard this referred to as a dependent clause, which is how I mostly refer to it, but we're going to call it subordinate for now just because that's the language that will be used on any standardized exam. But a subordinate clause cannot stand alone. It's dependent. which is why I do like the wording dependent clause. It's dependent on the independent clause, which we'll talk about in a second. An independent clause is a clause that expresses a complete idea. Therefore, it can stand alone. It should say alone, not along. So once my husband finishes work, we will go shopping. If we take what's in black out of that sentence and we just have we will go shopping, does that express a complete idea? It does. So we will go shopping is the independent clause. In order to have a sentence, a simple sentence is just an independent clause. If we go back, a complex sentence is an independent clause and a subordinate clause. So this is a complex sentence overall because it has both the subordinate clause and then the independent clause. And there are also compound sentences, but we're not concerned with them at this point in time. But do know what a subordinate clause and an independent clause are. Clauses are, I should say. Last we have relative clauses. So relative clauses are subordinate clauses that function as adjectives. These, so relative clauses use relative pronouns such as that, which, who, whom, or whose as their subject. And the purpose of using these relative clauses is to give extra information about the noun in the main clause without starting another sentence. So that's the woman who bought my house. So you can have that's the woman. This is an independent clause. Who, having the relative clause here, just gives us more detail. So who bought my house? It just gives us more detail about that woman. All right, and that wraps up the notes for today. So I will see you guys in a little bit, and we will start reading the next text.